We saw a change in buying patterns that we could see coming, but it's coming faster than we thought it would.
What we're finding is working people are saying, you know, we've heard it all before. In fact, we've been hearing the same message really for 40 years now.
Well, a couple of years ago, the Productivity Commission, we have one here in Australia, they came up with a report with 71 recommendations, not one of which has been acted on by the government.
People who have influence have been able to influence their council about height to boundary and all kinds of things in over 1,100 different ways. That's ridiculous.
Welcome to the Weekly Wrap, a summary of MBR's top stories from the past week. First up, MBR has launched its 4th annual Accountant Series this week, focusing on firms experiencing a slowdown in revenue, job cuts and a cautious outlook amid economic uncertainty. Here's a sneak peek at what's in store on mbr.co.nz.
Accounting is an industry that employs thousands of people in New Zealand. It generates revenue of more than $2 billion amongst the dozen largest firms in the country.
I think accounting is something that crosses into a variety of different fields, right? So Hamish often describes it as a bellwether for the economy.
My role is varied and has been through my career, always interesting stuff.
We've had clients that have been with us for 75 years.
They touch everything, so we should care about how they do their own business as well.
Very much focused on keeping close to our clients' agendas, understanding what's on their minds and how we ultimately support them be successful.
You have to sit in or stand in the shoes of your clients, understand what their challenges are and respond to that with proactive, good advice.
And so for the last few years we've been basically turning the mirror back on them and getting them to talk about themselves, just basically to get a handle on this very important sector and how they are faring within the New Zealand environment.
Yeah, look, Hamish, I mean, clearly the last 12 months have been, challenging for the economy, both in New Zealand and globally.
Perhaps unsurprisingly, it's been a quieter year for a lot of these firms. Some of the biggest firms, PwC and KPMG, have actually gone backwards as well, quite significantly, sort of 5 to 6% respectively.
Yeah, 24 was a challenging year, but I'd describe it as a year of highs and lows. So we experienced some really good growth in our audit and tax businesses, but it was a very challenging year for our advisory businesses.
These guys live and die by how busy their clients are. And so we've had a well-publicised recession in New Zealand over the last 12 to 18 months.
Look, we were pretty happy with how we went. Reasonably sort of muted growth still, but that was on a background of the macro economy still facing some pretty significant headwinds.
You're hearing stories all the time about companies going into liquidation, struggling to do things. M&A activity has been really suppressed over the last 12 to 24 months.
Usually our results, very much do reflect the economy. Usually we're ahead of GDP by, 2 or 3 basis points. We have grown in the last 12 months. It's been really hard work to get there, but ultimately very satisfied with that achievement and what's been a tough economy.
Overall this year, the smaller firms have been performing pretty well actually, so everyone was in growth territory.
We're pleased that we did still see growth and a little bit of a mixed bag across our offices. Insolvency market well up. I mean, there's no surprises there. We've had a lot of businesses that have failed, and so our insolvency business has been a standout, but a little bit of less activity in some of the other consulting areas.
Uncertain times have led to busyness in our industry. Clients are much more likely to use us for budgets or cash flows or business advisory advice when there are uncertain times.
The market's getting a bit more streamlined with the top end of the market going more limited, which is creating a bit more opportunity in the mid-tiers. So we're seeing plenty of activity in that area, and there are some entities choosing to look for better value where they find that they get more service at a mid-tier firm than in a large one. We're better to be a big fish in a small pond than a small fish in a big pond.
I think it's important to remember that the larger firms are working off larger bases, so I guess they've got a bit more to lose, or it makes growth a little bit harder to achieve, whereas the smaller firms are working off smaller bases of revenue obviously, and perhaps the barrier to growth there isn't quite as complicated.
I think the interesting aspect is in really sort of boom market times, your advisory businesses tend to flourish and your sort of regulated businesses like tax and audit more sort of slow and steady, but you find then in more sort of adverse economic conditions, parts of your advisory business suffer from some of that headwind a bit more. But what we've also still found is some of those broader themes around digital transformation, around driving efficiency through technology, through business systems, they remain very much in play. Investment is dampened a little, but they are still very strong themes.
So yeah, clients are still looking to do those bigger, longer term advisory pieces with you guys?
Still looking. Obviously they have a greater focus from an ROI point of view. And where we've also seen a little bit of a change is what our clients are very much looking for is a broader sort of partnership approach, whereas it's not just us providing a solution, it's an integrated solution with some of our alliance partners, your large technology players, and the clients are really looking for us to be able to bring that overall integrated solution together.
We saw a change in buying patterns that we could see coming, but it's coming faster than we thought it would. Traditionally, we've done a lot of assess and recommend type work, but we're noticing a demand from our clients to do what I'd refer to as transformation partnering. So working much closer with them right the way through to achieving outcomes.
And you're sort of sufficiently tooled up now for that sort of stuff, do you think?
Yes, we are, but it does require a change in skill set, and hence why we had to reshape the team.
There's been a net loss of about 500 jobs this year, which is massive. The firms collectively employ more than 8,000 people, so we're talking a fairly significant percentage of job losses here. That was felt more acutely at the big firms, the big four, PwC, EY, KPMG and Deloitte. That's not surprising given they are also the firms that grew the most sort of post-COVID, so they added hundreds of staff in those years when business was booming. Business has tapered off over the last year or so, and so unsurprisingly they have tapered off their headcounts as well.
So we're net about 50 people lower, and we have a team of about 230 people serving that market currently.
Now some of that is natural attrition. One of the firms tells me that they sort of expect up to 20% of their staff may leave in any given year, and so when you're in a down year, if someone leaves, you just might not replace them. So it's not like they've fired hundreds and hundreds of staff between them, but they have sort of not replaced people. There has been a couple of restructures, particularly in government advisory, but that has led to an overall decline in how many people are working at these firms.
And what about the pipeline coming out of the universities?
That is very much a concern. There's been a significant drop in students undertaking accounting as a major.
Level of grads, it's acknowledged that the number of students has fallen in half.
Students as early as high school are getting dissuaded from joining accounting, and the industry body, CANS, is having to work really hard to try to convince students that accounting is still a profession that they should be looking into.
You've seen a lot of professions, particularly sort of tech and engineering, become more attractive for younger staff to join. There's sort of a perception that they're more interesting companies to work with. They're also better paid, particularly at that junior level. And so accounting has sort of been going through a bit of a crisis in terms of how it keeps attracting people to the sector, to the industry.
Career counsellors are sort of telling students not to look into accounting because of things like AI, so they're saying that you won't have a job when you get to become an accountant.
Certain services and certain industries may be significantly impacted by things like AI and robotics, and I think the truth of the matter is clients are always going to be looking for that personal connection, and as long as people can add value, then I think there's room for professional services advisors like accountants.
Firms are really saying that this is something that they need to keep an eye on and focus on, and they need to get the message out there that you can still have a really good career in accounting.
It is a great profession to work in. You know, we do some amazing work, we get some amazing experiences, you can live a very good lifestyle. You know, when you get graduates coming into parts of our business, they're meeting CFOs and CEOs. It's an experience that you don't really get elsewhere.
We've had, over the summer period, 30 interns getting some valuable work experience at BDO, and just this month, 60 graduates joined us across the country. So it's fantastic when you do walk through the offices with the new blood and the buzz from the new graduates. I think through word of mouth and understanding that we've got good work-life balance at BDO is making a difference. And you know, we work hard, but we also understand that people have family and interests outside of work as well.
So these firms are constantly having to think about how they attract talent in the first place, but then how they also retain talent as well. You have managed to maintain a pretty similar staffing level year on year. How have you managed to do that when some of the other firms haven't?
Yeah, look, our focus has been on retaining the people that we can, and where there's change in market conditions, utilising them across different offices, or creating different skill sets for them and capabilities, and sharing them.
Have you introduced any sort of people-specific initiatives this year as well?
We found some of their work hours were very long, and it was having a negative impact on our people's experience. We're going to roll out very shortly a firm-wide time off in lieu program. It's very much directed at the well-being of our people. So you work some exceptional hours, you work a long weekend, that you actually get some time off to recover.
My mantra is I don't work weekends. I don't expect my staff to work weekends. I don't want my staff working in the evenings. They should come in, work hard and go home.
Our people, I think, are finding that it's a really valuable journey, having some really good conversations with them about that, and I think we're making really good progress.
But it is becoming increasingly difficult and expensive to keep this talent in these firms when other industries look more appealing.
Accounting is a male-dominated industry and has been for years and years. No one's really going to dispute that. And it's something that a lot of the firms actively acknowledge, that they need more women in the industry.
It's still stubbornly at the partner level in CA accounting. It's predominated by men, and so to attack the gender pay gap and narrow it, we've got to bring more women partners through.
The gender pay gap is slowly improving, and we're actually noticing a lot more firms starting to track it, and they're quite interested in the data. If we look at the Big Four specifically, we had 2 firms that improved their gender pay gap, and 1 firm that remained the same, and 1 firm that went backwards, I guess. Do you think it's something that firms really need to focus on, or do you think it will come naturally?
I think just sitting back and waiting for it to come naturally is not good enough, frankly, Kate. The evidence, the international evidence is that a more diverse range of people round a partner table or a director's table in a firm leads to higher growth and better outcomes. And so I think that it does need to be addressed.
I think data's key. Because data keeps you honest. So I might have the impression that we're paying fairly, that we're bringing talent through, but numbers tell a story, and numbers either back up that story or they highlight an issue.
When I started out 25 odd years ago as a partner in a CA firm with all men round the table, and I have seen that change, and that really useful change of having women round the table with a different angle on things.
They bring a lot of diversity in thought, and I think that really helps in client and team outcomes. What we'd like to think is we've got strong role models at the partnership table that those grads, first years, second years can look up to.
A lot of the smaller firms, they did report actually having more women involved in the companies, and so that obviously lends itself to a positive pay gap, which is really interesting.
It's dangerous to be middle-aged male, but yeah, look, we even at manager level, majority female, that goes throughout the business, and even today there's more females doing commerce degrees than males, so that will filter through. For us, it just doesn't matter what your gender is, you're still going to get paid the same, and we've already had that filter up into higher positions of, now time's passed on, and probably will spring even more the other way.
So we might have a gender pay gap
the other way.
We'll have an issue. We absolutely, yeah. We need more males in there. How do we get males into the partner level? Yeah.
All of 24 was spent, there was that awful mantra, survive to 25. We're now in 2025 and most of the firms are reporting that their clients are still pretty subdued.
All businesses felt the reduced level of economic activity. Equally, our involvement, and we saw the impact of a reduced government advisory spend during the year.
We're still in that tough cycle, and I think we all had to step into some hard decisions in 2024.
In the current environment, clients are very price focused, and we need to think about that in terms of how we're interacting with them.
We're all hopeful, just like all our clients actually, that the economy will improve over the course of 2025. I think everybody out there just wants the economy to get a bit of momentum.
Firms realise that they need to add value for their clients, and one way that's coming through is through different service lines either being added or being considered.
We have added Aldershaw's in Hawke's Bay. They offer wealth management services, which we haven't in the past had within the Markham's group.
Another key focus that's really shone through for the smaller firms is expansion, actually.
We've been actively looking to grow strategically. We identify as the top north half of the North Island as our playground. I think in the past we might have been a bit more internally focused, so now we've got our eyes wide open.
There's a bit of a hope that M&A, which drives a lot of activity for these firms, will start coming back this year, but basically it's still a pretty subdued environment. I think it's more subdued than a lot of the firms would have expected.
We are picking things to start picking up in the second half of this year. The interest rate drops will be baked in more. You'll start seeing that flowing through more so to household spending, and so households will hopefully be able to start spending more, which drives the general economy. So we are looking for a stronger back half of 25. Probably we're a little bit more confident of a stronger first half of 25 a few months ago, but we do think things are still a little difficult out there and a little slower than we'd hoped.
Optimism is gradually improving and investment intentions are gradually improving. The overseas markets and the export market is certainly in a lot better place than what it was 12 months ago. But over the last probably month, 6 weeks or so, there's a bit more uncertainty in terms of what that might mean on a global sort of geopolitical basis. But I don't think there's any sort of hockey stick coming anytime soon in terms of real sort of extraordinary market growth.
The change in interest rates reduction has obviously been a very welcomed initiative. That has started them to think about things that they may have been putting on hold, obviously capital expenditure, expansion in different areas, and so they're coming to us to talk about their strategies, which is really promising.
I think a number of them are looking to 2025 more optimistically than they have been. I think a lot of them have done the hard work around reconfiguring parts of their business that needed some attention. And then if you look at sort of what's predicted to happen around some growth coming back into the economy, that'll put a bit more money around everywhere, and I think they are more positive.
Our clients are looking to reinvent themselves for the future, and that's a great transformation agenda for ourselves. So, we're seeing good growth in the area already. We're looking forward to ongoing focus and growth in those spaces.
We've got to be sort of careful in terms of our own growth intentions and how we play that out. So for us, from a resource perspective, we don't see our headcount increasing significantly looking out over the next 12 months. But what we're also very much focused on is how we can actually use technology, AI, around the efficiency of our own delivery models, and that is also part of the way that you sort of combat more slower market conditions.
We've got a focus on bringing through our people. That's where we're really charged, and we want to see more partners over time. We're encouraging growth in that area. And so, yes, we're expecting some good growth again, but balanced.
I think we're going to see some uptick around transaction activity in particular. It was quite low for a portion of last year, but we've noticed that coming back in the last 5 months in particular. With the New Zealand dollar being low, I think we're an attractive environment for overseas private equity and other investors, and you're starting to see that.
We will see some activity from our clients that are well set up, that'll want to continue to grow and see this as a good opportunity. We do think our clients will see more general spending, but still uncertainty. So we've got a lot of things going on globally and other things that could have a negative impact on the New Zealand economy and may slow things.
Despite the tough cycle that we still find ourselves in, we do expect growth this year.
We've dropped down to single-digit growth for most of these firms this year. It's not going to bounce back up to the double digits we saw in the post-COVID years. And then, of course, 2026, we've got an election looming as well, which after the first half of 2026, pretty much everything will just shut down, waiting for the result of that. And so it's still going to be a difficult couple of years for these firms.
And you can read, watch and listen to the full series now on mbr.co.nz. The Council of Trade Unions has unveiled a bold policy platform calling for higher taxes, stronger worker protections and increased government investment to address the challenges faced by workers. Our political editor Brent Edwards with this.
CTU President Richard Wagstaff, you're putting out a kind of alternative policy vision for the country. Why?
Because it became clear to us that things weren't working well for working people in New Zealand. They were finding themselves really struggling with the cost of living, really struggling with the quality of work, and thinking, what is our future here? And so that caused us to go out on a 12-month conversation, which we've done over the last 12 months, from one end of the country to the other, speaking with large numbers of workers, community leaders, and saying to people, how's it going for you? Do you think it's working well? Or if it's not, what do we need to do? And so this Aotearoa Reimagined as a product of that exercise.
Essentially reading it, you're kind of pushing back on the sort of agenda that the coalition government campaigned on, right? I mean, their argument is that they've got a mandate to do this. What's your response to that?
Well, we're saying it's not working, and they made a lot of promises. We've had promises from successive governments about how workers are going to be better off, we'll catch Australia and so on and so forth. But what we're finding is working people are saying, we've heard it all before. In fact, we've been hearing the same message really for 40 years now. And the promise just doesn't deliver, and it's time to change course. To say that people are unhappy with the way things are going, I think would be a major understatement. There's a real sense of desperation, a sense of working hard, putting in a big effort at work and coming up with a sort of a paycheck to paycheck existence, a feeling that people's children aren't hanging around. They want to go to Australia where wages are higher, cost of living's lower, public services are better, and so forth. So that's a real, we've really got a strong message that status quo won't do. It's got to change, and we've got some ideas to do that.
I mean, I suppose if you think looking at wages, you'd bring back fair pay agreements. Is that a key?
Absolutely. New Zealand is unique in our bargaining system. We don't have proper standards for occupations and industries. Countries like Australia do, or European nations do. They have better wages. They have a better share of the economy, and so that's a fundamental plank, absolutely. But there's more that can be done than just that to improve working.
How do you lift, though, I guess, and this is the focus of this government, I guess the previous government, to lift economic activity to generate the revenue, the income to pay higher wages?
Well, we're signalling we really need to change course on that. We need an active government who's prepared to support thriving industries and thriving communities, rather than a government that recedes into the background and sort of lets things just go as they see fit. We've seen declines in the middle of the North Island around important industries in the North Island. We've seen Wellington decline sharply. We've seen the whole of New Zealand really under the pump because of government policy, which has been about compounding the recessionary cycle rather than trying to invest in the future in important infrastructure, both physical and social infrastructure. All of those things would generate wealth and generate jobs, and that's the path we want to see ourselves take here.
I think in the paper you make the point, I think, that investment in research and development, government investment, should be lifted to 2% of GDP, which is kind of interesting this week, given the government's announced it's lifting defence spending towards 2% of GDP. I mean, how significant do you see those contrasts?
Well, it says a lot, doesn't it? And, you can't really get there if you don't do R&D. New Zealand used to do R&D once upon a time, but for decades now we have massively underinvested in R&D as a nation, both public and private. And the government just doesn't seem to get the point that this is a priority. And we've seen several hundred science jobs gone in the last few months in New Zealand, which is in the opposite direction to where we need to go. Spending on defence isn't going to advance our wealth. Spending on R&D will. That's the kind of smart thinking we need to do when it comes to economic investment.
I mean, around tax, you say that obviously everyone's talking about there being a structural fiscal deficit. You say we need to lift tax take to 35% of GDP, up from 30%, introduce capital gains tax, which has been debated for some time, and also tax the excessive profits of supermarkets, the banks and the like. How would that work?
Well, the important thing is that these approaches to taxation have been used in other countries where they have higher investment. What we know is working people are saying, we pay our taxes, we put in the hard yards, and yet other people aren't, and other people who are making a lot of wealth in this country aren't. In fact, the people who seem to have the most seem to be getting the biggest breaks, and the most money is going to the people who least need it. So there's a real imbalance there, and we see ourselves as learning from other countries, but there's no doubt that our tax system's unbalanced. There's no doubt we need greater investment in our infrastructure and our public services, and that can only come from levying more fairly across the economy to ensure there's an adequate tax base.
I mean, this government's arguing that it's doing everything it can to attract investment in, and I think it would argue probably that the policy like that would not attract investment in. I mean, how do you respond to that?
Well, we understand the evidence doesn't support that thinking. In fact, I'm not an economist, but that's certainly our policy team is clear that is not a sufficient answer. This sort of plea to overseas capital to come and invest in our public services, PPPs and so on, we think there are better ways of doing it. The government can take a more active role. There's options for the government raising its own money. We think PPPs are a bad deal generally, and so there are different options than opening ourselves up to overseas capital to be exploited.
You know, the paper, sets these overall goals, but will you be doing more work then to come up with some detailed policy to underpin that?
Absolutely. There's a lot in there. It covers a lot of ground, and over the next 12 months or so, we'll be releasing more detailed policy papers on key areas in that document. And at that point, we'll all be able to see in more detail how we expect these things to work, and they'll be costed as well.
As part of this, I guess, to challenge the government of the day, but is the other part, if you like, to embolden the opposition parties or put a bit of steel in their backbone to make sure they adopt these sorts of policies and stick with them? I mean, particularly the Labor Party, which has had that sort of, particularly over capital gains tax,
It's really saying to all political parties, if you want working class vote, you need to do something that's attractive to working people. Working people are sort of had a guts full of the current situation. They feel stuck in a rut. They want to see bold change that really puts them at the centre of economic and social development. If political parties ignore that, then they'll do so at their peril, and the working class vote won't get out for them. So I think it's a challenge for all political parties, and we hope that political parties listen to this challenge, because it's vital that working people are part of our future and feel part of the sort of democratic process going forward. We've seen countries where that doesn't happen, and as far as I can see, it never ends well. So let's not do that in New Zealand. Let's develop government policy where working people are at its heart.
I mean, another contentious issue, that you picked is Treaty of Waitangi. You don't believe the government's committed to that at the moment, and so what changes need to be made in terms of?
Well, the key thing with the treaty is it can't be imposed by a parliament over a foundational document in New Zealand. And what we're saying is we can't ignore it. We need to deal with it, but let's deal with it in a way that is led by Māori, not led by the ACT Party and David Seymour for political advantage.
But in that sense, then, is there an argument at some point that there should be some agreement to say, well, that's how it's going to be done? Because, obviously the Treaty Principles Bill was an attempt by ACT to push in a different direction, but does there need to be some clear, statement from Parliament? This is how we see the treaty?
I think, again, the Parliament needs to say, let's talk to our treaty partners and let's figure out where to go to with the treaty. Let's not try and impose our will on it unilaterally without proper consultation, and without giving sufficient empowerment to Māori to determine for themselves how they see the treaty working, and let's see Te Treaty being engaged in on that process instead of the way we've had it, which is exactly the wrong way of going about it, and it certainly threatens to alienate large parts of New Zealand by doing so. So there's an opportunity there. Nobody wants to run away from our obligations under Te Treaty. What we do need to do is enter into a proper good faith process with our treaty partners. That's what we're saying needs to happen, not what we've been doing.
Over the ditch now, Australia's productivity woes have been laid bare, with recent OECD data showing a significant decline in labour and productivity. Lachlan Cahoon explains the threats to the country's economic future.
Well, Australia is often called the lucky country because it has enjoyed decades of economic prosperity. There are some worrying signs that this golden era could be under threat, and NBR's Sydney correspondent Lachlan Cahoon addresses these issues in his underarm column this week. Kia ora, Lachlan. Is Australia still the lucky country?
I'd have to say yes, it is up till now. I mean, the whole lucky country and thing came from an essay that was written in the 1950s. It was based on the idea that Australia's done very little to deserve its prosperity, that its success has been largely luck, that we've got mediocre policies, mediocre people, we don't work very hard, but we've been very prosperous. So we've been lucky in that respect, that our luck has really had nothing to do with us. It sustained us quite successfully up until now, you'd have to say. And it's often contrasted as well, Mike, with Argentina. Back in the 1920s, Argentina and Australia were very similar in economies, both young economies doing very, very well. And then the two paths have diverged very, very much since then. We've become much more prosperous. Argentina have had their economic crises over the years. So things can go either way, but so far our luck has sustained us.
So Australia, the lucky country, I did promise we wouldn't talk about sporting achievements, but how's the trend of productivity been then? Has it been like here?
Yes, and this is what I'm saying in my column, that there are a lot of similarities between Australia and New Zealand, and one of those is that we both seem to be at the bottom of the OECD tables in terms of productivity. For Australia, it's been slipping significantly in the last decade, and this is what I'm talking about in my column, the threat to us being a lucky country. Productivity has been negative since the pandemic, and it's only 0.6% over the last 10 years. So we're at the back of the pack with New Zealand on OECD tables, both in terms of labour productivity and accumulated productivity, which factors in things like capital and energy costs and those kind of things. So the things that while some sectors are increasing in productivity, like information technology and the media, those sort of technology areas, others are not. We have a public service that's increasing in size. We have a lot of people in aged care to cope with the changing demographic. And these are traditionally sectors which drag on productivity, and because there's a lot of investment going into those areas, it's one reason why our productivity is coming down nationally. So wages are growing faster than inflation, and we don't have the productivity which would typically justify this.
What's the answer? I know here in New Zealand we've got our Regional Development Minister Shane Jones saying drill baby drill, but what are the solutions for Australia?
Well, a couple of years ago, the Productivity Commission, we have one here in Australia, they came up with a report with 71 recommendations, not one of which has been acted on by the government. So it's a lot of statements about creating a more skilled and educated workforce, lifelong learning. And the Business Council of Australia, they came up with a report which is much more, as you would expect, more hard-arsed about it. Their focus is on workplace reform, cutting red tape, tax reform to drive incentives for R&D, for example. But, you know, productivity is always one of those areas that's a battleground between the unions and between the business organisations who want to change work conditions, who want to keep wages low, whereas the government, we have a Labor government at the moment, and they're encouraging wage increases, which at the same time is undermining productivity. So there was only one measure in the recent budget which addressed productivity, and that was to abolish non-compete clauses. That's whereas if you lose a job, you can't go into another business which is with a competitor. So that's been abolished for people who are earning under $175,000 a year. That might help with labour mobility, but the Business Council weren't impressed. So we don't seem to be doing very much to address the issue of productivity in this country.
Lachlan, do you see any big risks on the horizon?
I do, Mike, I do. I mean, our standard of living is slipping. It's the sharpest decline among all OECD nations since 2019. So we're working longer hours. Living standards are falling along with our productivity. So you know, you asked me at the beginning whether we could continue to be the lucky country. It's possible that our luck could be running out. I mean, certainly we're in the middle of this Trump slump, as we talked about at the beginning of our call off air. But you know, while these Trump tariffs are not going to directly affect Australia, the big risk is that they will affect China in a major way. And Australia's prosperity in the last couple of decades has been truly as a result of the increasing demand from China as that country has transformed its economy. So if China goes into a recession, if they're hit at all, that's going to really affect us in a big way, because they're our biggest trading partner, and without the Chinese to drive our economy and take our exports, we're going to be running out of luck, as they say.
Back home, as the coalition government moves forward with its Resource Management Act reforms, ministers face the challenge of balancing treaty rights with the need for streamlined planning processes and fewer objections to development. Brent Edwards has more.
Parliamentary Under-Secretary for RMA Reform, Simon Court. Okay, what happens from now?
Well, Cabinet has agreed that the expert advisory group's report, which we received over the Christmas break and have digested, is going to form the bulk of the recommendations that we're progressing with. And there are some other decisions that we still need to take as well, which we're working on over the next 10 to 12 weeks. So what do we do around the RMA's presumption of a general treaty clause, for example, and Māori rights and interests? What does it look like? How do iwi Māori enter the planning system in the new legislation? So we have essentially a marathon sprint over all the different parts of the policy that still need to be worked up in detail before we get to drafting instructions, which means we need to take a subsequent paper back to Cabinet with our final recommendations. It will be Minister Bishop and I in about 3 months' time.
Did you get any advice, though, on how the treaty should play in and what iwi Māoris, what their relationship should be?
You can imagine that there's a very wide range of views on that, but in the current resource management system, there is a presumption that there are general rights and interests as well as specific matters, such as protecting culture, protecting wāhi tapu and sites of significance to Māori. We need to make sure we balance those very clear obligations against this general amorphous sense of, well, you've just got to do the right thing, which has led councils and decision makers to ask for cultural impact assessments from a council that wants to replace culverts under the road, or a farmer who might want to replace their hay shed. These are not matters which iwi Māori, as far as I'm aware, want to spend their time on. I understand they prefer to spend their time on their own developments and actually working on environmental initiatives that improve the whole environment, not just what someone's doing on their property.
I mean, obviously, this new law, the big emphasis of it is sort of, if you own property, basically you can do what you like on your property if you're not harming others, right? So I guess in that context, how do you see it playing out? I mean, if Māori have, I suppose, particular cultural connection to a piece of land, even if it's privately owned, can you be seen to be harming them if you do something that goes against their wishes? Or
well, where there are significant sites where battles have taken place, where they are actually recorded by the New Zealand Historic Places, or Heritage New Zealand rather, it should be possible to identify those on a plan, at least at some level, so that people who own those properties or who are considering transacting that property can understand what those matters are. But general rights and interests in how other people use their property is how we've got to the problems with the RMA, which is far too many people having a say over how others use their land, people who are not affected, but who essentially are enabled by the RMA to turn up in court or to make submissions and say why people shouldn't be able to do things, whether it's a McDonald's in Wanaka, or something that NZTA or a property developer might want to do that affects the state highway or local roads. Essentially, the new system is going to say if you don't have an interest in that property and if you are not materially affected, then you won't get to object. That's going to be a huge improvement on the system we currently have.
I mean, one of the things we hear about, though, in terms of disputes between neighbours is around development. I'm just wondering how the new law will deal with, if someone next to me builds something, but it's going to obstruct my view and I don't like that. Will I have any right on that basis to say, oh, well, it's actually harming me? Or
well, when we live in cities, we assume that we're going to keep building our cities. And at the moment, there are over 1,100 different bespoke zones across 67 different councils in New Zealand, which means that neighbours or people who have influence have been able to influence their council about height to boundary and all kinds of things in over 1,100 different ways. That's ridiculous, and we're going to change that. Minister Bishop's made it quite clear that the Japanese model, which say has 13 different zones for urban and other activities, is where we should be aiming for. And what that means is communities will get to have a say, their councils will get to decide and make a democratic choice about which zones apply in which parts of their urban areas and districts. But at that point, people who live there are going to have to accept that this is the zone I'm living in, and the effects associated with that zone are acceptable. But of course, if people want to breach that by seeking to do something that is beyond what the zone allows, they're going to have access to a consenting system so they can demonstrate why they think it's important they be allowed to do that.
I mean, will it, if you like, weigh up, the greater interests, if you like? So, I mean, because you get in a situation where there may be competing interests. It's great for this person, but it's not so great for that person. But would you judge the greater benefit is here, therefore it goes ahead, rather than, even though, that person there may, have some harm, whether it's an obstruction of view or whatever?
Well, we just have to think about what the resource management system or the planning system is trying to do. Managing the effects on your neighbour, such as shading or noise, for example, they are real effects that do need to be managed above a certain threshold. So what we need to do also as part of the reform is work out what is material. Currently, the Resource Management Act says that effects that are less than minor need to be taken into account. We're thinking that threshold needs to be lifted significantly, because otherwise we'll end up arguing about all of these rats and mice issues forever and a day. So
I guess it's where we draw the line, though, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And so if we're thinking about things like views, views are not an effect on the environment. Whether I can see a view or not really is a public benefit. But it also has really significant public costs. So what we want to do in the new system is make sure that where people want to defend a view, or they think that a certain place should be able to be seen from a certain other place, then there's actually going to be a cost to transacting that. If people believe that an outstanding natural feature is truly outstanding, then there should be a process where, if it's on private property, the private property owner can say, well, actually, you, by applying this layer, are actually reducing the value of what I can do with my land by such an extent that I should be entitled to compensation. So we're exploring those mechanisms through provisions for regulatory takings and compensation just to provide that tension.
But will this bring an end to NIMBYism then, will it?
Well, I think people are always going to have an opinion on what their neighbour is doing, but what it will stop is the ability for people to object to what their neighbour is doing and object to development that is far away, unless it actually has material spillover effects across the property boundary, or unless it's something that is so significant that it warrants intervention or the ability to object from the other end of the country. Those matters must be extremely rare in the new system.
So are you confident you'll introduce the bill by the end of the year, and then be law before the next election?
We're working back from mid-2027 as the implementation date, which means the legislation needs to be passed this term of Parliament, ideally by July of 2026. So we're in an absolute sprint. That's also a marathon over the next 12 weeks to get a whole lot of work completed around the individual bits of policy and get the legislation into the House this year so it could be considered and passed this term.
How hopeful are you on a broader political consensus so that further down the track there's not, toing and froing with the legislation?
Well, I think during the previous government's resource management reform proposal, there was broad agreement across infrastructure operators and specialists, practitioners who work in the resource management space, councils, that spatial planning should have a really important role and should have statutory weight. So where infrastructure, either that's there now or that's coming in the future, is shown on a plan, that simply by showing it on the plan, that should essentially be the first hurdle in the resource management system. You shouldn't have to argue why the road needs to be there or the bridge needs to be there if it's shown on a spatial plan. So there's something we think we can agree on straight off. And where effects actually lead to impacts on neighbours or impacts on the environment, no doubt we'll have a robust discussion about that. But New Zealanders have voted this government in to make radical change in the resource management system so we can get on with building, so we can build the infrastructure we need to actually recover our place as a first world country. And that's what this reform is designed to do, and I believe there will be political support for it long term.
Simon Court, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again for joining us. Our news team is back from 5 a.m. tomorrow with the latest business news you can use on mbr.co.nz. See you next week.